Welcome to the Ratio Christi at UNCW podcast. We are here to cultivate thoughtful Christianity on the college campus, equipping students both to share the gospel and present evidence for the gospel. To learn more about Ratio Christi, come join us at our Monday night meetings. You can follow us on social media at Ratio Christi UNCW. Our speakers often use visual aids, so check us out on YouTube if you would like to follow along with those. Thank you for joining us today. If you like this content, give us a follow on whatever podcast app you prefer. And without further ado, let's dive into this week's topic.
Only one addendum. I feel like me and a buddy of mine, his name is Kevin Lehman, we've had a few projects together and they always eventually just sort of time out. So Veiled Kingdoms doesn't exist anymore, but it was fun while it lasted. Now it's just, I think the YouTube channel is just named Kev Lehman. I don't know. You can find him. He's getting ready to give me all the videos because he's going to remove them from that channel, but I'll have them if you just want to know all the weird paranormal stuff we talked about. But that is not at all what we're talking about this evening. Nothing weird or strange theologically. We are talking about logic, which I'm going to try to make fun and pizzazzy because logic can be really boring. If you've taken any sort of philosophy or structural logic class in school, you recognize it can be pretty boring. But we're not going to get deep enough, I don't think. Wow, you guys have a lot of Jack in the Box stickers. So we're going to just jump. Sweet. All right, that's Aristotle. But we're going to jump in. Logic, what is it? Actually, I'm going to pray for us first, and then we'll jump in. Let's pray. Father, thank you for an opportunity to study the way that you have made our minds to work. Thank you for giving us the space to gather, even on an evening where hundreds and hundreds and hundreds are also gathering to pray for the spiritual climate of our nation, the social climate of our nation. And I endeavor that tonight's discussion would be providentially timed, as we may find ourselves with more open doors than usual right now to have meaningful conversations, to have difficult conversations, to push back the darkness, to use theological language. And the discussion tonight, if we give ourselves to it and we seek to master it, will make us bolder in our proclamation and our ability to handle difficult conversations. So would you be glorified in tonight's discussion? Would you be glorified in our studying of the human mind? And would it be something that spurs us on to have conversation that means something this week, challenges us and challenges others? We pray this in your holy name. Amen. All right. So logic, what is it? It is a gift of Aristotle. Just kidding. Although he gets a lot of the credit, but it's not as if there wasn't logical thought before Aristotle was born or discovered the science of logic. He just gets the credit for making a science out of it. Hello? Okay. So really short, you'll find a whole slew of competing verses or competing definitions for logic. I'm just going to call it the system of ordered thought moving from premises to conclusion. Okay? We can do multiple conversations on what is logic and how do we define it and which school of thought defines it how and what and why, and we're not going to do all that. We're just going to look at logic as a system of ordered thought moving from premises to conclusion. And so we're going to look at the structure of logic to start with and how it works, how our minds work to move towards truth, what we hope is truth. We're going to look at a handful of fallacies, some of the ones that I think are probably more prevalent. That was the hardest part for me, was not covering 60 fallacies this evening, but only covering like 10. There are so many, and there are so many that are prevalent. And then after that, we're going to look at how to apply all of this logical stuff into a conversational format. If you've read Tactics by Greg Koukl, that's what we're going to be doing a little bit of at the end. And then we will talk about how that makes contact with what we're doing in light of apologetics and the gospel. So a system of ordered thought moving from premises to conclusion. I don't see any more moving hands, so I'm going to jump forward here. Okay. The West doesn't think anymore. Maybe that's global. Maybe the globe doesn't think anymore, but a lot of what I see is Christians who don't necessarily think anymore. Maddie asked a question, how do you differentiate between logical thinking and illogical thinking, or logical processing and illogical processing, which is a great question. And it's full of charged language that nobody even knows what it means anymore. When someone says, what is logical thinking? Right? If somebody were to ask you, what is logical thinking? Not what is logic. Don't define logic. What is logical thinking? And how do you know you're doing it? Right? Nobody talks about that anymore. Right? I'm going to try to help you understand what that is this evening. Okay? Try to help you be equipped to give an answer to that. Even if it's just premise, conclusion. Right? Even if it's just that. We're going to hopefully get a little deeper than that. But the West doesn't think anymore. And we're just primed. And this conversation is just really well timed, given what Charlie Kirk did on universities by having conversations, doing this, premise, conclusion, debating, arguing, having really intense conversations sometimes in a winsome way. That's what I hope you will be one step closer to being able to do at the end of this conversation, is to be able to have winsome conversation that can be difficult even. Help you think better. Or just think, okay? So, before we get started, before we actually get into logical structure, because we're kind of already started, the laws of thought, okay? All three of these, there's technically four. There's one that would be called the law of rational inference, but we're just going to leave that one aside. Basically, it just means you can infer things. But these are the three that are foundational to all thought. You might hear people say it's foundational to Western logic, but Eastern logic doesn't work this way. There is no such thing as Western logic and Eastern logic. There's just logic. There's just the laws of thought, okay? And so what's interesting is, like the laws of physics have no causal power. They don't do anything. They just describe what is already happening. These are the same. You guys do this every day. This is how you function every day. Driving here in your car or walking here, you were using these. I'm just going to help give you tools to understand what that process is as you use it every day. My favorite example is like you're driving in your car and there's like two kinds of people in the world, right? The light turns yellow and you speed up, slow down. It depends on the person, right? And the kind of car you're in currently and how far away you are from the line. My first thought is light turns yellow, where's the line? And then I make my decision. Can I make it? If I can, I'm speeding up. If I don't think I can make it, I'm slowing down. I'm literally doing this, right? And so the law of non-contradiction, something cannot be A and non-A. I just realized I didn't explain what the tilde is there for. I'm going to walk over there, although we're kind of spread out. I'm just going to draw right here. There are some things that I might draw this evening that come from symbolic logic. We're not doing it in symbolic logic this evening, but the tilde equals negation. So A and non-A, all right? Like a negative sign in math, sort of. But something cannot be A and non-A in the same sense and at the same time. If you just leave knowing this and nothing else, like everything else just sort of makes it into the mental pail, the pan, and just like falls out the other side, that's okay. This alone, most people don't even understand, okay? If somebody were to ask you what is a contradiction, most people will say two things can't be true at the same time. And then you say, what do you mean by true? And now you're having a 5-hour-long conversation because nobody even knows what that is anymore, okay? But something cannot be A and non-A in the same sense at the same time. So, an example. What is this? Marker. It's an expo marker. What is this? Which color is this? Green. What color is this? Neither one of these is a dragon. Okay? They're markers and they are either black or green. If you looked at me and said, that is a Ferrari, I would say you're on something. Okay? We all understand that this is either an expo marker or a dragon, or lots of things. But it's not both an expo marker and a dragon. Okay? Pretty simple. If you are in, I don't know, logic class, philosophy class, and you start feeling exhausted because it's 1 p.m. and you've just had lunch and you've been in class for 5 hours already today, you're going to start drifting off. You're going to start getting tired, right? Your eyes start to glaze over. You don't really remember what's going on in class anymore. And then you leave and you're talking to your classmate in the hallway and you go, dude, I was not in class today. I was just somewhere else. And he looks at you and says, you idiot, you were sitting right next to me. Okay? Not understanding what you're talking about. Not in the same sense. Were you in class? Yes. But were you like in class? No, your mind was somewhere else, right? Or if you were to say something like, dude, I was on another planet in class today, and your friend looks at you and says, you're dumb. You were sitting right next to me, right? Same time, different sense, okay? But if what you mean is, I physically wasn't in class today, I decided to skip and go get donuts. Now you're not in class, right? But they're different. Versus, I'm in class physically, but not mentally, versus I'm not in class physically. Those are different. And so something cannot be A and non-A in the same sense at the same time. You cannot both be in this class right now and not in this class right now in the same sense and in the same time. You can be here physically and not be here mentally, right? That's totally possible. But you can't be here and not be here in the same sense and at the same time. That's the law of non-contradiction. Okay? You can't both be alive biologically and dead biologically at the same time and in the same sense. But you can be alive biologically and dead spiritually, right? That's the law of non-contradiction. And since this is universally true, literally, to argue against this is to use this. If I say this is true and you go, nuh-uh, you're just doing this. You can't even argue against it. To argue against it is to prove that it's true. That's where I usually lose people. Okay? When I say A can't be non-A in the same sense at the same time, and you go, yes, it can. I'm saying A, and you're saying non-A. To even disagree with it is to play into this paradigm. We're going to keep going. Okay. Because this is true, watch this. Because this is true, it's either A or non-A, because it can't be both. Okay? If this is true, this logically follows. This falls out of it. Okay? It has to either be A or non-A. There's no middle ground. Okay? Either A or non-A. Can't be both. If it's A, because it's either A or non-A, says the law of excluded middle. If it's A, it's actually A. It's not, surprise, non-A. It's actually A. And if it's non-A, it's actually non-A. This is how we understand the world around us, okay? If you are, crossing the street and you see a car flying down the road and you go, is that a car or is that a butterfly? And you stand in the street to investigate further and the car hits you and you go, butterfly, right? No, okay? It's either a car or it's a butterfly. It's not both. And you're quickly going to go, that's a car, not a butterfly, and you're going to get out of the way. Okay? That's this. It's really simple. If you see something and you're like, what is that? And you take another look and you're like, oh, okay, that's what it is. That's the law of identity. You literally saw something. You thought it was one of two things. You said, well, it can't be both. It's either this or this. You take a step closer. Oh, it's that. That's it. Like, this is just really big language for what you do literally every day and all day. Okay? But this is important because this is thanks to this guy, okay, for sort of beginning this process to make this into a science and sort of lay this out for us. Yes, sir?
Your example for inside the room or outside the room, what if you're standing in the middle of the floor?
Then it's neither A nor non-A. It's B. You follow me? So you can absolutely be A and B at the same time, or A and non-B. or A and non-B and D and F and Q. But you can't be A and non-A. So if you're neither in the room nor out of the room, you're B. You're not A or non-A. Follow me? Okay, it's a good question. Yeah.
Wouldn't B be non-A?
No, not necessarily. If you are neither in the room nor out of the room, you're not A or non-A. You're something else.
So then that breaks the law of the excluded middle, right? Because it says something must either be A or non-A.
If your only options are A or non-A. If you're looking at two things, A or non-A, it's one or the other.
Right.
You could have A and non-A and then B and Q and Y. And you can have A and all of those things, but what you can't have is A and non-A together.
So if A is being in the room, and you're in the doorway, and you're technically B, that is still not A because you're not in the room.
We can use a different analogy, right? Even if I failed to show you this is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years behind it. But we can, or I can point you to Socratic logic, where he walks through all of these, Peter Kreeft himself. But the law of excluded middle, when you are looking at two instances of one thing or the other thing, it's not going to be both, it's going to be one or the other. And at that point, when we're talking about the door, we're playing word games more than we're playing logical structure games. Okay, we're not actually having a conversation of the metaphysics of what is in the room and what's out of the room. Now we're playing language games, okay? Which is part of what logic is semantics. Okay, I saw another hand over, yeah.
Jack has a follow-up question, but my example would be an osprey. Like it's a helicopter and it's a plane. Someone would argue an osprey is a plane, someone would argue an osprey is a helicopter.
Sure.
Two positives. So one's not saying it's not a plane versus one is saying
Sure. That again is going to default into a language game, as in that particular thing can be a helicopter or a plane, depending on how you're defining either one of those words. And so you have to, which we're going to get into at the end when we talk about how you apply this in language and communication. But when you are looking, and again, this is very technical stuff, and we'll see technical words this evening, like term and proposition and argument and how those things work. But when you're having conversations and you're talking to someone who's a clever rhetorician, they can work you into a knot, okay? And that's totally feasible. But as far as these laws go, the fact that this is true regardless is what causes these things to fall out. And you will have people that try to deny this. But if you ever find yourself talking to someone and you feel like you're tied in a knot and you're like, I feel like they just disproved the law of non-contradiction. You can't disprove the law of non-contradiction because you contradicted the law of non-contradiction. Okay? Even if it looks like you can, that's not how it works by definition. Okay? So it is true by definition. It's not true empirically through my five senses. It's true by definition, if that makes sense. Do we have any other questions? Any comments from Tom or Christian or John about that exchange?
I mean, I think a partly example, we would just say you can't have an osprey and a non-osprey.
Right.
I would that without be much.
Right. See, he reworked the phrase,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
I don't follow how B could be an option and it's not non-A. Because if B would have to fall under the category of non-A. So you're either in the room or you're not. If you're somewhere in the middle, then you're not in the room. So that would fall under non-A. So B can't be an option unless it falls under non-A. That fits with the law of excluded middle.
Go ahead.
I think part of it is because when we're talking about in the room and not in the room, it's not a one or the other option because we are, like it's, as you're walking into the room, you're not going to be in the room or out of the room. It's not a one or the other option anyways. So this wouldn't really be able to apply because, right, there's got to be one or the other. But if
Right.
there's already more than one. So a better example might be, I'm not touching the table, I'm touching the table. You can't be touching the table and not touching the table at the same time because that would be, there's only two options there. Walking through a door.
Which is just the semantics of it.
Yeah, I guess you could be in the roof, you could be in the walls, like there's
Yeah.
Depends on what you mean by in the room.
Right. Right.
What you mean by in the room.
All right. All right.
Be fully in the room
You can't be
and fully
both.
out of the
Go-
room.
I think we're equivocating on A.
Yes. Yes. And we're going to get to equivocation. Because there's lots of language games that can happen. But for the sake of time, I don't want to necessarily move any more on the semantics of in a room or out of a room. It's like a bit from that movie Robots when I was a kid with Robin Williams. Okay, we're going to move forward just for the sake of time. Okay, structural parts of logic. And again, this is like really watered down. We're going to get into the metaphysics of some of this like really briefly. But that in and of itself can be a really deep hole. Three structures for logic, three parts, which are terms, propositions, and arguments. Think of these like Lego bricks, okay? You have the smallest kind of Lego brick that can't get any smaller. That's terms, okay? And then you have things that you build with terms, which are propositions. And then things that you build with propositions, which are arguments, okay? So terms together make a proposition. Propositions together make an argument. Arguments together just make bigger arguments. Unfortunately, we don't have another word for that. But that's just, you just go from there. Arguments. Okay, but it boils down to terms. And it boils down to propositions. Okay? Let's see here. All right, a little bit of why this is the structure. So terms, a little bit of linguistics, I guess. Terms are a verbal, or I guess you could just say words, because terms, never mind. Terms are a physical, external expression of a concept you have in your mind. Osprey, room, pizza, okay? Elliot, which if you know an Elliot, a different person has came to mind, but in my mind, it's my son, right? And so terms, as you verbalize them, words as you verbalize them, they signify, they're signs, they point to concepts in your mind, okay? Which is why defining terms is very important. Because when I say God and a LDS member says God, we mean something super different. Or if I say God and a Hindu says God, we mean something super different, okay? That the same word, in English anyway, same word, but the concept in my mind of what I think God is super different than the concept in, say, a Hindu person's mind for what they think God is, or an atheist's mind, what they think God is, okay? We can get really specific. Me and Porter probably don't exactly specifically think totally exactly the same way about the concept of God, right? I've read different things than he's read, okay? So defining terms is super important, all right? Why? Because the terms point back to what you're ultimately trying to explain, which is the concept you've got in your head. That's why you're communicating, okay? Due process, a really big term right now in conversations that are happening all over the place about immigration. Okay, due process. So what do you mean by that? Let's get on the same page conceptually before we move forward, okay? A judgment is expressed as propositions, okay? Marker is a term. Black marker is a proposition. This is a black marker. That is a judgment. This is blank. Okay? You could say, that person is good. That person is bad. That person is correct. That person is incorrect. That person is immoral. That person is moral. Those are judgments. That Ferrari is way too much money, right? That's a judgment, okay? The Ratio Christi t-shirts are awesome. That's a judgment. Not an argument, it's just a judgment, okay? It's a proposition. When you take two concepts and you put them together, right? This is how judgments are made in your mind. And then you externalize those as proposition sentences. This is a black marker. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. This is the smallest building block. Yes. So you put terms together like the concept of the color black in your mind, the concept of the idea of a marker, and then lastly, the concept of the verb to be. Okay, this is the verb to be, a black marker, right? That's a judgment. Okay. In argument, Okay, again, our language, right? Judgments gives rise to propositions. Arguments gives rise to arguments, all right? I know the language doesn't help us much, but you can have an argument inside your mind, okay? Just like you have concepts and judgments in your own head, arguments are in your own head as well, and the good kind, not when you're anxious and you're arguing with yourself. That's not what I mean. But mental relations between judgments, okay? For example, I'm going to write on the board. And so I'd like to pick a color that's going to show up well enough that everyone in the back can see, right? If I were to have a yellow marker behind me versus the black Expo marker, I might think, this is a black marker, this is a yellow marker. My goal is to have something show up well. My experience is that the black marker is going to be more visible from the back of the room, so I pick that one. Okay? That's an argument, at least in my head. The way that you express it would be, all black markers are more visible than yellow markers. I want people to be able to see from the back of the room. I'm going to pick the black marker over the yellow marker. That would be how it's said out loud. That would be a syllogism, okay? So concepts give rise to terms. Inside your head, outside your head, inside your head, outside your head, inside your head, outside your head, okay? This is the metaphysical workup for how this works in language, okay? Any questions about that? If that totally lost you, you can jettison it. It's not ultimately necessary for what we're talking about this evening. Okay. So, building a syllogism. You have a premise and a conclusion, okay? And this one shows up in any logic textbook you probably will find. It's a really old, really popular, famous syllogism. All men are mortal, or some variations are all humans are mortal, okay? But all men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, okay? So you have A, you have B, and you have C, okay? That's the sign for therefore. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, okay? And so you have a premise and a conclusion. Now if we back up one slide, whoop, mental relations between judgments. Okay, mental relations and logical relations between judgments and propositions. All men are mortal, right? Term, proposition, okay? All men are mortal. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, that makes Socrates what? Mortal. Pretty simple, okay? That's a logical flow. If I were to say all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is a chicken, that has no logical connection. Socrates has a logical connection to the rest of the argument, but chicken doesn't, right? That there's no logical connection, there's no flow of the relationships between the terms and the concepts, okay? All men are mortal, Socrates is a man, Socrates is mortal. Premise, conclusion, okay? I've got a list of these here, right? All dogs are mammals. All mammals are animals. Therefore, all dogs are animals, okay? But if I were to say, therefore plants are animals, well, okay, that's silly. But the irony is we will make simple mistakes like that in our logic and our reasoning without recognizing it until somebody shows us that you're making that kind of mistake, okay? But that's a basic example for what sneaks into our, that's called a non sequitur, but it sneaks in to our thinking all the time. Premise, conclusion, okay? Any questions about this structure here? If we were actually in my course, this would be the time where I hand out your syllogism packet and you tell me if they're valid or sound. If you want homework just to practice, I can give you this at the end, okay? All right. Oops. Okay, so when we're looking at a syllogism, let's take all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal, right? When we're looking at that, there are two ways that you evaluate an argument. First, you evaluate the argument on its logical structure. Then you evaluate the argument on its contents. Okay? Its structure, then its contents. Okay? When you're looking at its structure, you're looking at what's called logical validity, or is the argument logically valid? And this is a technical term, not valid like I like it or it seems to apply, but valid in the strict technical definition for the study of logic. And valid is when an argument is when its conclusion necessarily follows from its premises. Like necessarily, it's inescapable, okay? The conclusion is unavoidable. If all men are mortal, and Socrates is a man, then the unavoidable conclusion, because those two premises are true, is that Socrates is mortal. There's no way around it. The conclusion that Socrates is mortal is unavoidable, okay? And that is the full weight of using this, understanding the laws of logic and how syllogisms work. Because if you actually can produce a conclusion that follows from two true premises, you've proven something, which is a pretty big deal. You've not just persuaded someone, you've proven something to be true. Regardless of whether or not they agree with you, what you're talking about is universally true. That's a big deal, okay? That's a really big deal. It's what all pursuits in academics are trying to do, is prove their thesis to not just be persuasive, but true, okay? So an argument is logically valid when its conclusion necessarily follows from its premises, okay? So necessity here, not just as in like when my 5-year-old comes up to me and says, Dad, I want to watch Danny go, and I say no, and he says, but I need it. No, you don't. It is not necessary, okay? Not necessary, right? However, it is necessary that Socrates is mortal if those two premises are true. Then the conclusion is unavoidable. It's unavoidable, okay? Any questions about that? It seems clear to me because I teach this all the time. But if you're thinking about something or you're chewing on something, or you're hung up on something, I want to address it. Cool beans. The next aspect here, okay, we're not looking at the structure of the argument, okay? There are lots of ways an argument can be not true. It can be A, B, therefore C. It can be A, B, therefore A, which would be circular reasoning, because it makes a circle, right? A, B, therefore A, circular reasoning. You could just have A, therefore A. That would be begging the question. Okay? There are other structural ways that you can fail this. Okay, but when it comes to what's called being logically sound or soundness, this is when you examine, right? If you can get past this part, that your argument is the structure of it is logically valid, okay? Because you can have an argument that's valid that's not sound, okay? For example, if I say all cats have 4 legs, barring the fact that some cats are born malformed or they get hit or whatever, they go through some sort of trauma, they lose a leg, right? Generally speaking, all cats have 4 legs, okay? All cats have 4 legs. Tom has 4 legs, therefore Tom is a cat. It's tomcat. But ups. Okay? So therefore Tom is a cat. Now, that argument is valid because if it is true that all cats have 4 legs, and it is true that Tom has 4 legs, then the conclusion is unavoidable. It is necessarily true that Tom is a cat. Yeah.
No, that's invalid. If all 4-legged creatures are cats.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. There you go. All 4-legged creatures are cats. Right? Semantics is important. Thank you. All 4-legged creatures are cats. Tom is a 4-legged creature. Therefore, Tom is a cat. Good stuff. Okay? So because you can be logically valid and not be logically sound. The only way that you are able to get to this, and this is the real goal here, is to be sound, is to have an argument that's functioning and can prove to be true, is that your terms are clear, okay, which can sometimes just be subjective, okay? Your terms are clear, your propositions are true, which this can take legwork too, just going anyway. And then your argument is logically valid. For example, if I were to say the bank is lit, what image comes to mind for you?
It's on fire.
Bank is on fire. Right? What else?
Party in the bank.
Party at BB&T. Right? What else?
The side of the river, and it's just like, it's nice.
The side of a river bank, and it's sunny, it's nice. Right? Every one of you in here thought financial institution. And Lydia's heard this lecture before, so she thought riverbank because she knows where I'm going. Right? And so everyone in here is like BB&T. Right? But I've not specified bank or lit or any of those things. Those terms are super unclear when pressed. Okay? When pressed. All right? Another term that is super unclear, intolerant. When pressed, that word is super unclear, right? Really unclear, and especially the way that it's used in our social climate, okay? But terms have to be specified. You have to do your job to ask what do you mean by room? What do you mean by in the room? What do you mean by osprey? What do you mean by touching, right? Right? What does that mean, right? The quantum physicist is like, well, actually, your material never actually touches the physical table because of energy fields and blah, 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 blah. Okay? So you have to do your job, your legwork in the conversation to make sure that your terms are specified. Okay? I've watched two students have what looks like a really great conversation, and they get to the crescendo, and here comes the conclusion, and they realize they've both been using the word moral in different ways the entire time. Right? What is right and what is wrong versus my opinion about what is right and what is wrong, okay? And then propositions. Your propositions have to be true, okay? So all men are mortal, we say is true, okay? Socrates is a man, we say is true. Therefore, Socrates is mortal, which we say is true. But if somebody wants to challenge, I don't know, the first premise, all men are mortal, someone says, what about the Apostle John? I've heard that he's still alive somewhere on an island in the Aegean Sea. Right? There are some Christian groups who think that he like never died, right? And you're like, so all men actually aren't mortal, right? Well, now they've challenged the truth of one of your propositions. Okay? Yeah.
But wasn't Jesus technically a man and a God, so that means that he was mortal and immortal, which is like he's kind of like two things at once.
I don't want to get into the Christology of that. Talk to that guy. Okay, so that's a really good question. But the idea is you're trying to make an argument for something, and someone is going to challenge your one of your propositions. You say this is obviously true, and they go, no, it's not. Fight me. And you go, well, let's back up. Let's talk about why this proposition is true. And you have to establish that your terms are clear in the middle of a conversation. And then establish that your propositions are true in that conversation. Because you're trying to convince them of what? Your conclusion. Okay? And you go, but that sounds like a lot of work. Yeah. Having meaningful and / difficult conversations is totally a lot of work. But you do it because you want to be bold and you want to love the person you're talking to. Right? You want to love your neighbor as yourself. And I'm sure if you were stuck in a really tough situation, you would really want someone to come in there and have a meaningful conversation with you to get you out of it, even if you're being, a butthead about it. Yeah.
I think that it's worth it to have a conversation with somebody that doesn't want to have.
You might not be able to, because if you're trying to have a this kind of conversation with someone who doesn't want to do that, you won't actually be able to. You'll never get to a point where you agree on the terms. You'll never get to a point where you agree on the propositions. You'll never get to it because they don't want to have a conversation. They just want to fight. Having an argument and having a fight are two different things. Okay, you can argue with your friends and your family and your spouses and whatever, your professors, your peers. You can argue, which is good. Fighting is not helpful. Nobody really wins. You're just sort of wasting. You're just at a really expedited rate. You're converting oxygen to carbon dioxide. That's really all that's happening, right? And building up cortisol in the brain. Okay, good question though. Okay, and then your argument is logically valid. The way that you get the final standard here is that you're able to have all three of these things. Terms are clear, propositions are true, and the argument is valid. And that takes legwork. If you're in a conversation, if you're writing a paper, it's different. But if you're having a conversation with someone, that can be, it can be stressful, not all the time, but it can be. Okay, any questions about that? Because we're getting ready to go through a bunch of fallacies on ways that these are wrong. Yeah.
Somebody says like it's just semantics, they're saying terms, which is
Yeah.
like the foundation.
Yeah, that's one of my, well, it depends on the person you're talking to. So I was having a conversation with a psychiatrist actually, and she was like, this is just semantics. And I was like, yeah. What's the point? And she was like, well, this is going nowhere. And I'm like, no, semantics is really important. Like defining the words you're using and using language precisely to communicate truth is really important. But people will just say that. That's actually a fallacy too. It's sloganing, but that's not on the thing tonight. But people just like throw slogans out and as if like no, I don't agree with you. Just doing semantics is really important. Right? And it's a part of how we communicate, but that's one of the ways that people are like looking for the parachute. Whether they don't really want to have the conversation anymore and they just sort of want to get out of it.
If they make that statement, you can ask them, is that statement just semantics?
Boom, roasted. Be sure to say that in conversation. It'll make them really happy. Yeah.
What do you call it if like A and B are true and you use A and B to form a conclusion that's not like that comes from A and B but is still false? For example, like she likes ice cream. Satan also likes ice cream, or she is Satan.
That's good. That would be simply a non sequitur. Remind me of your name, friend. Chris. So when I was giving the example earlier about the cat and the four legs, my words actually weren't tight enough as a net to have the logical necessity that I needed until he modified the words the way that I was using them. Right. All four-legged creatures are cats. Okay. If I just say cats are four-legged creatures, and Tom has four legs, therefore Tom is a cat, that's not necessary. Tom could be a dog or an elephant.
Right.
But if I say all four-legged creatures are cats, all of them, and he has four legs, okay? So when you say she likes ice cream, Satan likes ice cream, therefore she's Satan, it's not valid because the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. Okay, good question. I like that we're cooking. Yeah.
I like what it's like before Chris modified your proposition. Like cats have four legs, Thomas.
4 legs.
Oh, wait.
So like,
Untrue premise,
well, they're all untrue premises, right?
well, cats have 4 legs. Is a true premise.
Right, but all cats having 4 legs or all four-legged creatures being cats is not true. Tom having 4 legs is not being true, right?
You could have 2 true premises that are invalid, so the conclusion doesn't follow.
Yeah, well, I mean, I could say, all cats have 4 legs. This feline animal has 4 legs. Therefore, butter pecan ice cream cures cancer. Right? Like it can be just completely disconnected from what you're talking about, and that's a silly example, but that would look more or less like a straw man in conversation. It would look like somebody a red herring, trying to divert you from conversation. Right? That would be what it feels like. Someone trying to change the subject. Yeah.
What if all 3 statements are true, but it's still a logically invalid argument? For example, all cats have 4 legs. All cats have 4 legs. Wait, what was it again? Yeah.
All four-legged creatures are cats. Because that's not true, though.
No. All cats have 4 legs.
Yes.
Kiara is a cat, therefore, I'm trying to think of something that's true. Kiara is a female. Because all 3 statements are true. Kiara is in fact a female, and she is a cat, and all cats have 4 legs, but still.
Sure. So you can have 3 true statements that aren't connected logically, right? I could say Trump is the president of the United States. Grant Forrester is an apologist with Ratio Christi. Therefore, Kevin Collada is the head of school at Coastal Christian. All three of those are true, but they have nothing to do with each other, right? That's an easy example. But in your example, it feels like they're related because they're sharing some of the same words. But in reality, there's not a logical connection. There's not a logical relationship between those propositions, even though they share terms, okay? And that just takes practice as you sort of feel through how arguments work and you write them and you use them and you have them used against you. And it takes practice to develop this kind of thought process, okay? Hello? Oh, that's not supposed to be there. Talk about that later. All right. So equivocation, several ways that you can get all of this wrong. We've experienced one already with what is in the room. What does that mean? Okay, equivocation is when the same term is being used in two or more different senses in the course of an argument. Okay, fascist, that's a great example. Okay, intolerance is a great example. Those are just social applications. But like bark and bark. What am I talking about? Dog in a tree, right? Bark and bark, okay? Those you can equivocate. I love my wife. I love my son. I love pizza, right? All three of those are different. I don't love pizza the way I love my son or my wife and vice versa, right? They're different. So you can equivocate. You can use the same word with two different definitions. And people will sometimes do this, well, most of the time I would imagine it happens on accident. But I think, I bet what it would look like in conversation is you're talking to someone and you're both sort of coming from things that you've wrestled through on your own. Like you have an argument that you're sort of working on, they have an argument they're working on, a position you currently have. And you are more or less regurgitating research and information, positions you have, and without knowing it, your position has terms that you haven't completely isolated yet, or they do, okay? Within the argument that you have or within the worldview you hold, you have terms that you're equivocating and don't necessarily catch it. Yeah, but that's the idea, that you have two words, two terms, right? If we think back to this, right? If we have all men as in males, Socrates is a man. Oh, I guess that wouldn't work anyway. This is tough. Coming up with examples on the spot is tough. All right, so
I can give you one for the Socrates one.
Okay, go ahead.
So put it back. I'll show you. So when I was in college, I had a roommate who had a dog named Socrates.
Oh, that's beautiful.
So it would be all men are mortal. True. Socrates is a dog. Yes. Its dog's name is Socrates. Therefore Socrates is mortal. Yes, the dog is mortal.
Oh yeah, but you've equivocated. Yeah, Socrates dog versus Socrates man.
So what you would say is Socrates, the ancient Greek philosopher, is mortal.
Yes,
right?
yes,
You gotta be clear.
yes. More words, more semantics, to Sam's point, more semantics fixes the problem. You need more words to bring about clarity. Yes, very important. That's really good. That's a good one. Okay, equivocation, red herring is when you introduce an irrelevant subject matter. The one that, at least for me, I just smacked the mic. I hope that doesn't deafen you later when you're editing this. But an example that I've experienced more often than not is when I'm having conversations about the pro-life, pro-choice issue, right? And I start talking about what is a human being, right? What is the unborn, all of these kinds of things. And all of a sudden, conversations about sex ed start to show up, conversations about contraceptives show up, conversations about mothers' rights start to show up. And I'm like, all of those are very important conversations, right? Sexual education, contraceptives, the rights of the mother, those are all really important. But those things are a distraction from the current conversation, which is what is the unborn thing? What is that? Okay? It's a really important distinction. And so if you're going from what is the unborn to, okay, well, now we'll talk about contraceptives, and now we're going to talk about this other thing, you're not actually finishing pieces of the conversation. You're just jumping around, and nothing is actually happening in the conversation. And then you both leave exhausted. And you're like, we didn't go anywhere. Well, yeah, because you were flying all over the place instead of drilling into one subject. Okay? And so red herring is when you introduce an irrelevant argument. Oh, beautiful example. Years ago, when Trump and Hillary were doing their debate, and Trump is pressed on his taxes, and he's like, well, she deleted all those emails, right? Or vice versa. They're like pushing on her, and she's like, yeah, well, this guy is like cheating with his money. And like, sure, both of those could be true. They have nothing to do with the question that you were just asked, right? Don't get distracted. Red herring is an example of that, okay? Introducing an irrelevant point into the argument. Now, the irrelevant point could be important and could even be something that's true, yes, but that's still not what we're talking about right now. Let's finish this thing first, then we'll move to the next thing, okay? Clarify your terms, your propositions, get a conclusion. You go, we agree, okay, cool. Next subject, all right, yeah.
What if the person asking the question is asking them like bad faith? And the reason why you're saying, why aren't you calling out them, is like you're saying, you're pointing out the fact that they're calling you bad faith.
Yeah, so, is that the next one? Nope, okay, well, actually, kind of. That's also a kind of fallacy. It could be what's called tu quoque, which is you too, right? We'll get to that in a minute. Or it could just be ad hominem, which is you insulting the person instead of having a conversation. Okay, again, if you're having a conversation with someone and it comes to light that this is really in bad faith, just tell them you wish them the best, right? Pay for their meal maybe if you're having lunch with them, and then change subject. Like, you like sports? Right? If they don't actually want to have a meaningful conversation, then don't try to force that, right?
Yeah, like I'm talking about like you're in your little Christian booth, and then some guy comes up and he asks questions about Jesus, but it turns out he doesn't really care for an answer. He's just an atheist.
Right. He just wants to stir stink. I mean, well, if you're at a booth, you're not going anywhere. So I guess you're just in a stink stirring competition until he wants to go do something else, or she, right? But if you're just having a conversation with someone and you're at liberty to go, hey, I appreciate it, let's talk again soon, and like walk away, you don't have to stand there and just get fought with someone who doesn't actually want to have a meaningful conversation. The same thing's true for you, right? If you're in a bad mood and somebody wants to have a good conversation and you're feeling spiky and you just want to, don't be a turd. Don't do that, right? If you want to have a meaningful conversation, do it. If you don't. You can't force these kinds of things, okay? But ad hominem, Latin for to the man, okay? Think homicide, right? To the man, okay? Attacking an opponent's character or their motives for believing something instead of disproving their arguments, okay? I don't know. Somebody says something like, what's an in-house controversial issue? The pastorate, right? You walk in and someone's like, oh yeah, my pastor's a female. Or, oh yeah, and you're like, well, pastors can't be women. And they're like, yes, they can. No, they can't. Yes, they can, right? And you're having it, now all of a sudden you're fighting with someone about who can be pastors, men, women, both, right? And all of a sudden, let's say you're on the side of women can't be pastors, just for the sake of this particular argument. And they go, you're just saying that because you're sexist. You're like, what? Like, I'm saying that because of the reasons I just gave you, not because I hate women, right? Or vice versa. The other person can be like, well, you're just, this person can be like, you're just saying that because you're feminist. And they're like, what? No, here's my reasons. I gave you the reasons why I think this is true. Stop insulting me, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess exactly, so it depends on the reasons they give. You give
right.
them why you believe it's true. For example, like, if you say, I don't believe women can be pastors because I think women are stupider than men.
Then it might be true that you should call that person an idiot and a sexist, but you still don't do that because that's still this. If they give you all of those terrible reasons, you don't go, you're an idiot. You look at the art, you look at the reasons and go, well, let's talk about why these reasons are bogus. You still don't look at them and go, you're a sexist and you hate women, even if they actually are, because that still doesn't prove anything. You need to attack the reasons they have, okay? Even if their reasons are terrible, okay? Is that good?
Yeah.
There's never a point when you should attack the person's character for the sake of argument, all right? You're trying to attack their reasons, Okay. All right. Special pleading. Using a double standard or arguing for an unjustified exception. You're sitting at a stoplight in your car, right? And an ambulance like blares right by you in the right-hand lane, right through the intersection. And you're like, oh, what? Well, I'm going to go too. And you just drive through the red light and the cop pulls you over. And you're like, what the heck? He drove through the red light? Wah, wah, okay? Unjustified exception. Just because an ambulance has a justifiable exception as to why they can blast through a red light, even though they do it safely most of the time, right? Because they're trying to do what? Save life, right? Like you're just trying to get to Boombalotti's 5 minutes earlier, right? And so, right, they have a real justifiable reason for why they're doing that. You don't, okay? So when you try to argue for an unjustified exception, you're just special pleading, okay? Go ahead.
If you're in an argument with somebody and somebody uses a double standard and you call them out for using a double standard, would that qualify as an ad hominem?
No, because you're not calling them out as the person. You're saying the argument you just gave is special pleading. Let me walk out why I think you're using a double standard. Now they might disagree with you, but that's part of the conversation. Here's why this is why it's a double standard and why it doesn't work. Yeah. Happens to me all the time. If it comes back, oh, right on the tip of your tongue.
I feel like there's a lot of situations where there like exceptions are like really defer people's opinions.
That's fair, right? And so if that's the case, then when you go, hey, that's special pleading, and they go, no, it's not, if they even know what it is, right? And you go, hey, that's a double standard. They go, no, it's not. And you go, well, explain to me why it's not a double standard. And then they start explaining it to you, and you go, oh, yeah, I can see why you're coming from that way, right? Then I was wrong. Or if you say, no, that's still a double standard, here's why I think it is, and you try to convince them. Sometimes you just get to a place where you just don't see it the same way. You talk for an hour, and you're like, hey, I still disagree, right? Let's sort of stew on it, and we'll have this conversation some more later if you'd like to, right? But they do. That's exactly right. So these are not like things that are hard and fast are the 3 laws of thought. These can occur in a plethora of ways. All right, straw man. This is kind of just like what it sounds like, right? I don't know, who's a giant linebacker in the NFL? Yeah, right. Right. So like, but if he were to walk through the door, right, and we were gonna like tackle, I'm getting smushed, for sure, right? But if he were to walk in and I were to go, ladies and gentlemen, and I were to present a scarecrow version of him, that's just like hanging there, and then I just like tackle it to the ground, and I'm like, crush that guy. You'd be like, no, you didn't. That's the real guy. That's a straw man. Okay, same thing. If you give your argument to someone and they go, oh, so you're saying this, and they like reproduce your argument in some weaker version and then like knock it down and they're like, I win. You're like, no, that's not what I said. You've straw-manned me. You've made a weaker version of my argument just to knock it down to make it look like you've won. This happens all the time. And unfortunately, a lot of the times this happens in our really polarized news outlets, our media. This is constant, okay? Because it's just clickbaity, but you're not actually refuting the person's argument, you're refuting the weaker version that you made, okay? And so you really need to be paying attention when you're having a conversation. I've watched students in debate having a conversation, person says, here's my argument, person strawmans them, and then the original person says, yes, that's what I'm saying. And I'm like, nope, you didn't catch that. They just misrepresented your argument, right? And then the person goes, well, boom, checkmate. And they're like, oh my, right? Because they didn't, now all of a sudden they're like, no, that doesn't work. Well, now you're miscommunicating because you didn't catch that the person misrepresented you. in the dark ages where people didn't think at all, don't get me started. But in the Middle Ages, when you would have debate, whether it was theological or political or economic, you would have one side present their case, and then the other side would have to regurgitate the case to the point where the original person would say, yes, that's exactly what I think, before that person could ever respond, to prevent miscommunication and straw man. We don't do that anymore. Yeah.
I didn't know that's a medieval practice, but I will do this when talking to people
Just-
about the gospel. Like
So good.
just to like, it feels like we're getting nowhere.
Yeah.
It usually eliminates equivocation.
Mm-hmm.
And also like, because you can't advance until they agree with how you presented their argument,
Yeah.
and vice versa.
Yeah.
It actually eliminates like styles.
Yeah. And I was with Charlie Kirk hot on the press right now. I was watching some dialogue with him and another guy, and they were having the conversation about illegal immigration and deportation and due process. And Charlie Kirk called it an invasion. Like I was like, it's not an invasion. And he goes, okay, what is an invasion? And they had like a back and forth defining what invasion was, right? He said, or that guy mentioned something and he called it an invasion and he did it. Now they're on the border of getting ready to start miscommunicating. And then Charlie stops and says, what would you define as an invasion then? Right? He doesn't let that happen. He doesn't let the straw man build and sort of move forward. So this takes careful listening. You have two ears and one mouth. You should listen twice as much as you're talking. Okay? Listen carefully in conversation to prevent this from happening. Yeah.
So what if you took it to an extreme, like you said, turn it into a weaker?
Yeah.
Like, you do a weaker point. What if you take it to an extreme where you say, like I've heard the argument you just did, immigration.
Yeah.
Like,
So like hyperbole.
every person from Mexico came up to America.
Right. Okay. That's different. That's different. So that is, and this is again careful conversation. That's called the Latin phrase is reductio ad absurdum. That's taking someone's argument and then logically and justifiably, okay, reducing it to absurdity. Person says this is true, and you say if that is true, this crazy thing over here is also true. That only works if they are actually logically connected. If they're not, you're just misrepresenting their argument. Okay? And so that's reduction to absurdity. That's different. You'll also hear people say, hey, I don't want to straw man you. I want to steel man you. Meaning I want to have a good conversation and I want to make sure I'm hearing you. I want you to, everything you're saying, I want to make sure I understand. So I don't want to straw man you. I want to steel man you. That's the goal. Is you want to give you want to understand the full weight of their argument before you start trying to argue with them. Okay?
I found this to be like one of the best ways to build up good development conversation.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like you articulate your positions in a way that they would like.
Mm-hmm.
Really shows that you're actually listening.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just found like it's a way to really take down the temperature of a conversation.
Yeah.
I feel like it's
Yeah, statements like, I really want to understand where you're coming from. Like, I actually want to understand your position on this and know more about what you think. That's huge. That's huge. Yeah. You too. This also happens in our political climate. Dismissing someone's viewpoint on an issue because he himself is inconsistent in that very thing. I tried to come up with one off the top of my head, but like an easy example would be, I'm driving 80 miles an hour down College, right? And Christian sees me fly by. He pulls up. He starts driving 100 miles. 100 miles out to catch up to me. He rolls his window down. I roll my window down. We're both zooming at 80 miles on College, and he goes, "You're speeding!" And I go, "Shut up! You are too." Does that mean I'm not speeding? No. So me going, "You too," doesn't mean that what he said is invalid. Okay? And so if you have someone that you do know is guilty of a particular behavior, right? Someone who is actually guilty of that thing, and they look at someone else and they say, "Hey, they're guilty of this thing too," right? Our culture really quickly wants to go, "Hey, you can't talk about that. You're just as bad." And you're like, "Yeah," right? This is important from a Christian perspective too. Like, I'm a sinner saved by grace. And anyone I'm talking to, when I'm like, "You're a sinner, you need Jesus." And they're like, "How dare you?" I'm like, "Look, me too," right? Me too. Okay? And so this doesn't prove anything. When someone's like, you're just as bad. Like, sure, maybe. That doesn't mean that what I'm saying is false. It just means I'm guilty of it too. Okay? Genetic fallacy. This I see in apologetics all the time, more or less coming from like postmodern, new age, new thought sort of directions, which is, it'll sound like this. You're only a Christian because you were born in North Carolina, or you're only a Christian because you were born to a Christian family. If you'd been born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be Muslim, right? As if what that is supposed to prove is that Christianity is not true. Okay, if you were born in Saudi Arabia, you'd be Muslim. Okay, the correct response to a statement like that is so. That doesn't mean Christianity is false. It just means that if I was Muslim, I'd be wrong, right? But you don't catch that. You're like, oh my gosh, they're right. I might actually be Muslim if I was born in Saudi Arabia. Who cares? There's lots of people born in Saudi Arabia that become Muslims. That doesn't mean that Jesus isn't king. It just means that they're Muslim. It means that I would be Muslim, okay? So condemning an argument because of where it began, right? Or how it began, or who began it, okay? Let's see. Like the Southern Baptist denomination, okay? One of the largest Protestant denominations in the world. And the reason it's the Southern Baptist denomination is because of their early affiliation with the Confederacy and slavery and things like that, right? Does that mean that all Southern Baptists are, slave-owning, sharecropping, racist bigots? No, right? But the genetic fallacy is, well, you can't be Southern Baptist because early on it was blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's the genetic fallacy. This happens a lot. You'd be, in the way that I mentioned, you'd be Muslim if you're born in Saudi Arabia. Sure, right? Nobody thinks this is true. Like if I were to say something like, you use the Arabic numerical system because you were born in America, right? Or you think that 2 + 2 = 4 because you were born in the West. Like, no, that's just true. The Arabic numerical system is just what we use for mathematics, right? 2 + 2 = 4 is just true because it's true. It has nothing to do with how I was born or where I was raised. Yeah.
Question. This is a bit of a theological question.
Okay.
If you're saying that like Satan is the father of lies, so that implies that everything from Satan's mouth is a lie. So doesn't that logically imply a genetic fallacy since all lies are from Satan? And if you're saying, oh, it's obviously a lie because it's from Satan. Like, I don't know, like, I remember I was having a conversation in Paradise Lost about someone, and they told me that I have to think through the arguments logically about why they're wrong, but I couldn't help but think, but doesn't that go against the principles of faith? If you only believe in God because you're logically able to work it out, doesn't it defeat the purpose of faith in God? Yeah,
it depends when we, because we don't want to equivocate when we say that Satan is the father of lies. He's not literally the father, as in his offspring are lies, right? And it's not literally the case that everything that he holds to be true is a lie, because he also believes that God is, if we believe the Bible, that God is Trinitarian. We also believe that demons understand that God is one and they shudder, right? There are lots of things that Satan would understand to be true that are true. When we say that he's the father of lies, we mean that when you are engaging, if you ever find yourself engaging with Satan, that he's likely lying to you. That's what he does. He deceives. He's the deceiver and he destroys. But he does believe things that are true.
But what about my other point about like reasoning through? Like doesn't the idea of reasoning through an argument kind of defeat the purpose of having faith in God? Like isn't it supposed to be like you believe in God because you have faith, not I believe in God because of love?
So that's a much larger conversation to define faith. But I would define faith not as the absence of evidence, okay? This is a whole presentation we could do. Right, this is the Greek word. Did you guys define pistis as allegiance? Did you guys define pistis as allegiance? You guys did that already? All right, I'm gonna largely leave this one alone then. Yeah, okay, cool.
Yes, I'd like that.
It's a very, yeah. I can't give that particular question due diligence here, given that it's 8:45 already. But that's a good question. Begging the question, This I hear people misuse all the time. They'll say, well, that particular thing begs the question, and then they ask a question. That's not what this means. Begging the question means that you're assuming that your conclusion doesn't need proof. Okay? What it looks like when you write it out, like I said earlier, okay, you're just assuming that your argument is true without any proof, right? This is supposed to be something other than your conclusion, right? The Browns are the greatest football team in the NFL because they are. It's so not true, right? Right? But when you meet people who just assume that things are true and they assume that they don't need to be proven, that's begging the question, okay? Very important. Or they'll an example. I was having a conversation with a young man here. Gosh, this was over a year ago now. We were having a conversation about materialism and the soul and the mind and what is a person. And he said, thought experiment. Let's say that I were to take your brain out and take your wife's brain out and switch them, and then you were to wake up in your wife's body. And I said, time out. You just begged the question for materialism, meaning you just assumed in your hypothetical that materialism is true without proving that it is. What did he do that did that? He assumed I was a what? Brain. All I am is brain, right? I take your brain out, put your brain in your wife's body, and then you wake up, right? And I'm like, well, why don't you take my heart out and put it in her chest, and then I wake up? He goes, because your heart, and he was like, oh, right? He assumed that all I am is brain. That's begging the question. That's assuming that materialism is true without proving first that materialism is. First, you got to prove that all I am is a brain. That's the exact conversation we're having, okay? So that's begging the question.
So,
yeah.
By that extension, is everybody who call Christians fascist begging the question?
In a way, yeah. In a way, that's a handful of fallacies all like in a sandwich. Just like name calling is ad hominem, it's straw man, it's all kinds of stuff. Unhelpful mostly. So loaded question, right? Loaded question. I don't know, something like, Christian, you still using steroids? Right? Right? What did I assume in my question? That he uses steroids, right? There's no way he can answer that without incriminating himself, right? If he goes no, it means he was. If he's like yes, it means he is, right?
Can't he answer, I'm not using steroids? Isn't that technically an answer to your question?
He could say, I'm not and I never have. Right? He could say that. Like, I'm not and I never have. He could. Or he could just be like, that's a loaded question. You could call me out on my fallacy.
Why are you assuming I'm using steroids?
Yeah, right. Like, what? Yeah, what? You know, I mean, because look at those guns, man. All right, so, right, like that's a loaded question. Or, you know, hey, Grant, you still a hateful bigot? I'm like, what? I probably would just laugh. But winsomely, I hope. Not like, ha, but like, that's okay. Okay. There you go. Right, yeah. Or it's like, I beat my wife all the time. To the door to open it for her, right? Like there's all these kinds, we use loaded language. And when it's loaded in a question, what you're doing is you're begging the question you're begging a conclusion inside the question, okay? Inside the question, right? Someone goes, you still a Christian? Dangerous. What do you mean by Christian, right? You still believe in God? What do you mean by God, right? If you go, yeah, I'm a Christian, well, now who knows what they think that word means? And you were like, I affirm that, whatever that is in your head, Christian, however you define that. Careful, okay? And so rhetoric and logic is important in conversation. And so, you know, you'll get got enough times in conversation that you start asking more questions. You start you stop making statements and you start asking more questions, okay? How many more of these do I have? Okay, last one. Argument from silence. All the time. You know, the Bible never says anything about X, whatever that thing is, right? Not Twitter. But the Bible never says anything about blank. The Bible never says anything about blank, right? You're like, and? Right? That doesn't mean anything, okay? An argument from silence is when you try to infer a conclusion based on the person's absence of affirming or denying something, okay? When a thinker / writer fails to comment on a thing or a position, we cannot conclude that he either affirms or denies it, okay? We use this fallacy in our scripting all the time, right? You ask somebody a question and they go something like, I cannot confirm or deny. And you're like, no, literally nothing. He just said, I can't do either. And you go, okay. You no longer can logically proceed. But we usually infer, there's something there. No, you can't literally, logically, you can't do that. That's an argument from silence. That's why we have that clause in our due process, right? That's why we have the ability to do that. So you don't get got, when you're, going through something, okay? You're potentially incriminated and you're trying to not be, okay? So there is no such thing as arguing a conclusion. Oh man, what was one that I heard? I heard a pastor say it. Oh man, I think it was about baptism. And the pastor said something like, the Bible is silent on whether or not babies can be baptized. And he goes, but it's a strong silence. I'm like, what? It's just silence. Like, if it is silence, that's the end of the conversation. You can't prove anything. I'm like, no, you can't. What? What is a strong silence? What is that? Okay? That's emotional rhetoric is what that is. And it gets a lot of people. Okay? So an argument from silence, logically speaking, you can't do that. If the person that you're trying to sort of engage with has not made a claim on a particular position, you don't get the right to go, I bet they're silent because, no, that's not how this works. Okay? That's a straw man, actually. And missing the point. Well, it's a lot of things. But you don't get to do that. Okay. Burden of proof. Here's where the rubber meets the road for all of this stuff in your head between terms and propositions and arguments and syllogisms and logical validity and soundness and all of these fallacies. Okay? When you're in the middle of a conversation and you're trying to apply the things that we've all just discussed. Wow, it's almost 9 o'clock. And you're trying to apply all these things, okay? Where the rubber meets the road is you're going to be in a situation and someone is going to ask you a question or they're going to make a statement and you're going to feel this like rising desire to just want to blah all the stuff that you know and be like, they can't believe that. I can't let them believe that. And you just want to, okay? You want to vomit your opinion all over them, okay? Don't do that. Okay, if somebody says something in class, they raise their hand and they say something like, well, I mean, science has obviously disproven the Bible. And you're like, okay, and you just want to go off on a tirade in the middle of class. That is not, it'll just make you look crazy. That is not the approach, okay? If the professor says something like this, okay, if they say something that's an affront to Christianity, right? What you don't do is raise your hand and be like, that's wrong because blah. You don't do that. Whoever makes the claim, okay, is the one who bears that burden, okay? So somebody says something like evolution, like you're having a conversation, and they go, well, obviously evolution disproves the existence of God. You don't go, no, and you jump down the Michael Behe rabbit hole and all the stuff about like how evolution's not true. Like, you don't do that. You just say, can you walk that out for me? How does evolution disprove God? Okay, the burden of proof is on the person who makes the statement. Now, if you fly off the handle and make 12 statements, now you do bear the burden of proof. Okay? It is not, how does Kokel say it? It is not, Greg Kokel wrote a book called Tactics, where he goes through these things. But he says something like, it is not the Christian's responsibility to refute every argument from a non-believer. Okay, it is not the Christian's responsibility to refute every argument from a non-believer. It is the other person's responsibility to prove their argument. It is not your job to disprove it, it's their job to prove it. And it has not been proven until they do that. Somebody makes a statement, that's not proven. You ask them to prove it. You put them in the position where they have to bear the weight of proving that thing that they just said to be true. And that's an uncomfortable position to be in sometimes. Yeah.
What if they think that we have the burden of proof since I hear actual atheists arguing?
I do this to my students all the time.
That since we're the ones who believe in God, we have
Yeah.
prove that God exists. And so if
Right.
they don't believe in God, they don't have to prove anything.
Right. So Coco goes in all of this. There are ways that professors and people who use microphones for a living, people who speak for a living, they know all kinds of ways to like move the rhetoric around and make it feel like the burden of proof's back on you. The golden rule here, whoever makes the claim is the one who has to prove that claim to be true. It is not your job to disprove it. Okay, now if you're in the audience and you're one of 3,000 and they're like, any Christians out here? And you're like, I mean, me? And they're like, burden of proof to prove God's existence on you. And you're like, no, it's not. I've not said anything. You're the one with the microphone. Prove that God doesn't exist, right? Like, well, I don't have to do that. Well, cool. Next, right? Like, you don't have to engage that. Don't step into that trap unless you want to. If you want to, that's fine, but you have to understand what you're signing up for. If the professor says science has disproven the Bible and you go, no, it's not, and they go, prove it, and you want to try, go for it. Okay, but don't get hoodwinked. Don't be like, wait, how did I end up in this situation? Well, you do. You kind of ran your mouth. Instead of stopping and breathing for a second and asking a question, you like jumped in and just like, with your opinions everywhere, and now you have to prove those. Okay, and that will be how people who hold microphones for a living, that will be how people get you in conversation because they know how to navigate those kinds of things. And I do that to my students all the time when I'm doing atheist role play or I'm pretending to be any sort of worldview, right? I'll make a crazy claim and they go, and maybe they even ask a question, which is the right response. And I go, oh, the burden of proof's on you. And they go, oh, well, and they just like give an answer. They don't know. And so don't get got by this, okay? The burden only belongs on the person who makes a statement. This is your universal position. Unless you make a statement, and then it's your job to bear the burden of proof. Okay, so here's how you stay in a position where you don't bear the burden of proof. Okay, this is how you can be in a conversation, use all the logical principles we've just discussed, and never have to bear the burden of proof. There are lots of ways to navigate conversations like this. This is what Greg Koukl calls the Columbo tactic. Okay, in his book Tactics, and so. We could do a whole presentation on just this and like walk out the practicality of this. But somebody says something like, evolution disproves the Bible. And instead of getting riled up and going, as to why you think that's not true, you just say, oh, quick question, what do you mean by that? And they're like, by what? And you're like, well, what do you mean by that evolution disproves the Bible? And they're like, oh, well, and they keep going. Right? You could do that forever. They keep going and you go, what do you mean by that? Oh, what do you mean by that? Oh, what do you mean by that? Right? It's like the kid who's like, why? Right? Question marks don't ever put you in the position to have to explain yourself. They have to explain themselves because they made the statement. What do you mean by that? Now, again, if you run your mouth and they go, what do you mean by that? Now you're in the position that you bear the burden of proof because you made the statement, okay? So never commit to a period in a conversation. Never commit to a period in a conversation when you could ask a question mark, okay? That would be the way that you stay out of the hot seat, yeah.
What if you say, what do you mean by that? And they say something along the lines of, it's not my job to educate you.
Oh, I'll say, well, that's not very kind. I'd like to know, I really do want to know where you're coming from. Like, I'm interested in your opinion, right? Now, if you're like, what do you mean by that? That's not helpful, right? That's not helpful. Okay, but if you're like, oh, I've heard people say that before. I don't really understand. Can you help me? What do you mean by that? Right? Your tone, control these muscles, please. Okay, nothing like this, right? Control these muscles. All right. But if they're like, it's not my job to educate you, be like, dang, right? Like, I actually want to know where you're coming from. I was just curious. If you don't want to talk about it, we don't have to.
Yeah, because
right?
I see that all the time.
Sure.
Somebody will ask a question, they'll be like, it's not my job to educate you. You Google it, stuff like that.
Sure.
It's just so annoying.
Cool beans. If they don't want to talk, we don't got to talk. Right? Yeah. There are ways, like, it depends, like, do you know these people? Are they friends of yours? Right? If they're strangers and you're like, hey, Right? That's weird, right? But if you know, like if it's your roommates or whatever, and you're, I don't know, you're cooking pancakes and they're like over here at the table talking and you're like over here and you're like, oh, and you're like, you know what? I heard you could kind of just find a place to butt in. And you're like, I heard somebody say that the other day. I'm confused on some of that. Can you help me understand where you're coming from? Like, what do you mean by that? There are ways that you can get in. It just takes tact. Don't be a butt. It's crucial. Universal rule, all right? The next question would be, how did you come to that conclusion? Lots of people will probably be able to do question 1. Way fewer people will have success in question 2, okay? So when we think about logic, okay, and we think about our syllogism, all right, and you have A, and you have B, and you have C, okay? And you say, what do you mean by that? You are asking for them to elaborate on this part, which most people, they have lots of information on this part from YouTube and Reddit and Instagram and Twitter, right? They have lots of things to share with you about this part. And then you go, oh, that's interesting. How did you come to that conclusion? Now you're asking for this part. And very few people, at least in this day and age, know how to walk this out for you. Okay? And so, how did you come to that conclusion can make someone feel almost offended. Not because you've been rude, but because now they feel sort of conversationally naked. And they're like, I don't know how to answer that question. Like, what do you mean? And you're like, well, like you said this, and this is what you think about that, right? And they go, yeah, no, okay. What convinced you that that was true? And most people just regurgitate stuff that they've seen online or they've heard from their professor or friends. They've never actually sat down to do the hard part of like walking out the logical relation that leads to this conclusion. Okay, so be gentle with questions like question 2. Okay, how did you come to that conclusion? Right? How did you come to that conclusion? Not helpful. Okay, not helpful. All right, so in any manner of ways to say it, like, oh, okay. So what convinced you that was true? Or like what led you to that position? What convinced you of that? Okay, great questions. But those are challenging because lots of people, back to like the early slide, people in the West don't think much anymore. They just sort of regurgitate stuff they've heard from other places. And we are guilty of that too, right? We're guilty of that too. So how did you come to that conclusion? And then once now you have all of this, okay? If they've successfully answered this, and maybe you ask these 2 questions a few times back to back in the midst of your conversation. What do you mean by that? Did you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that? Or how'd you come to that conclusion? What do you mean by that, right? And shake it up. Don't just be the weird kid who asks the same question over and over and over and over and over again, right? But that is kind of what you're doing because you want to actually flesh what they think in a conversation. You want to flesh it out, right? You have to be listening. That's the hard part, okay? So you walk these 2 questions out, you get the argument, right? Now you're a smart, logical person after this 1.5 hour presentation on logic, right? You've mastered logic now. And so you're thinking, what do I do with this? Okay? There are a handful of things that you can do with this, right? I can't actually give you a question 3. That's going to be on you. These 2, you can just rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat, right? These 2 you can just do back and forth without being a logical master, right? You understand all of the fallacies. But this takes practice because you actually have to be able to give them something. Have you considered that this is begging the question? Have you considered that this doesn't flow logically from the premises? Have you considered that this other way of looking at your argument? Have you considered that, okay, that you'll just have to figure out in whatever conversation you're having at the time, and that takes practice, and it takes tact, okay? Yeah?
Is there another way of wording that?
The third one? Yes, because at what you're doing, right, like you can just forget the 3rd question. I'm just giving you this as a template. But what you're doing in the 3rd question is now you have sort of what they think, and now you want to push. This is how you push, or this is a way to push without putting the burden on you. And now you have to answer for all your stuff. Let them answer for all their stuff, right? You want the burden right there, and you can sort of guide the conversation by asking questions, all right? There's any manner of ways to do this. You could, You could even punt to an example. One of my professors said something like that in class, and then he said that was an example of begging the question, which is like this. This is like begging the question. Do you think that you're begging the question? Right. All kinds of ways that you can sort of get to a push. That just takes practice. But this is just like a boiled down way to do it, right? Or you can say, hey, that to me, that sounds like the genetic fallacy. And you don't even have to use language like that, right? That sounds like ad hominem, okay? You don't have to do that, right? But you can say, well, it sounds like you're saying that this person's wrong just because you think they're hateful, right? So help me understand, like, we shouldn't be hateful, but even if, I don't know, who's a famous racist, right? Insert famous racist, right? Even if this person says 2 + 2 = 4, it's still 4, even if they're a hateful person. So help me understand, because I really do want to know where you're coming from. So help me understand why this person being hateful means that they're wrong. Because it sounds like that's what you're doing. If that's not what you're doing, help me understand why that's not, right? Universal conversational position. Okay, you can do a lot from this position, actually. Okay, so that's the idea. And you're like, and it sounds like you're pandering, maybe, right? But you're trying to push our cultural climate does not like being challenged or pushed. Most people don't even like this question, okay? So if you find, maybe even after several conversations with this one person, you get to this point, okay? That's great. Lots of people don't even get there, okay? Unless you're a Christian. He gets here in like every one of his conversations ever. Just a great communicator. Okay. Who is it that had like 100 meetings with the LDS in town? I had like 1, and then I couldn't do anymore. Yeah, right? There you go. Great opportunity of like knowing how to like balance some of this, right? Without just being like, boom, 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 and then never getting another chance to have another conversation. Conversation over, right? Right? Yeah, okay. So, tactics, have you considered? Okay, so why does all of this matter? Okay, because the gospel is the appeal to a human mind, okay, regarding the truth of Christ's reign over the earth, and this requires argumentation. Okay, I have Bible verses to prove it. Uh-oh. Did I not put them in here? I lied. Hold on, watch this. I'm going to cheat because I have the power. All right. Ignore the other presentations. The one that looked like Mormonism was made by a student titled Moronism. We had a conversation about how that was not loving. All right. We did talk about it. All right, where is it? What was I looking for? Oh, yeah. It's up here. There we go. Okay. So Acts 9:22. But Paul increased all the more. This is literally right after his conversion. Like he gets knocked off his horse, he gets blinded, he gets healed through baptism in Damascus, gets up the next morning and immediately goes to the synagogue to start beefing with the local religious leaders. I mean, like the next day, okay? And so Saul increased all the more in strength and confounded the Jews who lived in Damascus by proving that Jesus was the Christ. Not by saying, just have faith, right? And back to the previous conversation about what faith is, okay? But proving that Jesus was the Christ. That means having reasonable and meaningful conversation about something. Acts 18:4. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath, that would be Saturday, and tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. Having logical and reasonable conversation. Okay? And then in Acts 19, it says, and he entered the synagogue and for 3 months spoke boldly, reasoning and persuading them about the kingdom of God. All right? There's I can go through the whole thing, but there are dozens of verses like this just in the book of Acts alone. Okay? So when we are doing this, we want to be winsome, we want to be clever, we want to be compassionate, we want to be accurate, all of the adjectives. We want to be someone that can be like Paul and prove and persuade and reason and have conversations that matter, even if they are difficult. Again, ignore the moronism presentation. Okay. So, Why does any of this matter at all? Because if you are a believer in Jesus the Christ, then you have a commission to go out and spread that reality with those around you. And the way that we do that as human beings is through the laws of logic, because that's how we think. That's how we process. That's how your mind works. Okay? If you go out tomorrow and you're like, Jesus died for your sins and he rose from the dead and he's ascended into heaven and he's sitting at the right hand of God the Father Almighty, and they go, prove it. And you go, I'm so glad you asked, right? And then you start giving them reason and evidence and you're trying to convince them that what you're saying is true. You're just doing logic. You're being reasonable in your thought process, okay? So this all will make immediate contact for you tomorrow when you wake up and you have dialogue with yourself, right? Dialogue with your friend, dialogue with a peer, a professor, your coworker. You're going to immediately start using all this stuff, whether you remember anything we talked about or not, okay? All right. Any questions? It is 9:10. Holy smack. When did I get started?
A little later. We started late, about 7:35.
Okay, cool. I don't feel so bad then. No questions at all. Yeah.
What's the test to prove if a premise is true or not? If it corresponds with reality?
Yes. So one step deeper than we got is there are two kinds of reasoning. There's inductive and deductive. All that we did tonight was deductive. We didn't do inductive at all. But the way that you prove that a premise is true, or that you in conversation you argue that your premise is true, is through inductive reasoning. Deductive is from universals to particulars, which yields certainty. All men are mortal. Socrates is one instance of all men, therefore he's mortal. Inductive would be the other way around. Inductive is taking a particular, applying it to in a universal way, and then trying to give reasons as to why that connection is made. And that is how you prove a premise. Yeah. Did I see it? Yeah. I didn't know if it was you. Yeah, you? Go ahead.
I forgot what it was again.
No worries. No worries at all. Yeah.
We can go back to the room now.
Go ahead. You actually want to? Oh, okay. I was like, sure. Okay. Go ahead.
So all those definitions and stuff and all those terms, what do we do when we're encountered by people that do those things?
The fallacies, like the mistakes. So what I wouldn't do, unless you're talking to someone who seems like they know this vocabulary, what I wouldn't do is use this vocabulary, okay? So like Chris said earlier, when I said, Christian, you still using steroids, right? The response isn't, hey, that's a loaded question. That's a fallacy. And you don't have to do that. You can just say, why are you assuming that I'm using steroids, right? You respond with a question. And it sort of takes practice to know sort of how to ask questions and what to do in conversation. But someone is begging the question, and better example, someone is using a straw man, right? Maybe they're misrepresenting you, and you say, hey, with all due respect, that's not really what I'm saying, that's a misrepresentation. Can I clarify? If they're like, no, like, cool, see you later, right? And if they're like, oh, sorry, yeah, of course, go ahead, clarify, then clarify, right? You just want to call it for what it is. And so what Greg Kokel would call narrating the debate. If you're in the middle of a conversation with someone and you feel like one of these is happening, you just go, well, hold on one second. I'm sorry. I think we're misunderstanding each other. I said this, okay, and then you said that, and then I said this, which if I'm honest, I think misrepresents you, or vice versa, right? And I said this and you said that, and that really isn't what I was saying. Right? And you literally almost like you get up and you replay the debate and be like, this is where I think we went wrong, and then try to move forward in the conversation.
What if that person still believes that what they're saying that you said is right?
Sure. Then you keep asking them how. So if that's the case, I would say, well, here's what I said and here's what I meant. Okay? So how is what you're saying the same as that? That's what I would say. Like I would just say, here's what I said and here's what I meant. So is that what you're saying I'm saying? And if they're like, yeah, and you're like, that's not really, here's the difference, right? And you just you just stay in the mud for a while. That's okay. Sometimes you don't get to like a concise conclusion. Did I see another hand shoot up? No? Okay, go ahead.
What happens if they outright reject your definition? For example, say you're a fascist, and then they're like, okay, define fascist, and then they define fascist, and you're like, I don't. With all due respect, I don't think that's what a fascist is. And you say
Sure.
What you think a fascist is, and they're like, no, you're wrong. You're definitely a fascist.
That person doesn't sound like they want to have a conversation. So I would say, oh, that's not how I've heard fascist defined before. This is kind of what I think it means. Or I mean, depending on how aggressive you want to be, you can be like, that's just not the definition of fascist. Here's the definition, Webster. Okay, here's the definition of fascist. Okay, so let's both agree that at least Webster knows more about what he's talking about with definitions than I do and you do. Here's the definition. And if they go, no, cool, right?
What if they do like loaded terms like?
Oh, thanks.
What if they do stuff like you are?
Put it in my back pocket.
You're like sexist or racist or whatever, and you're like, okay, define sexist or racist. And they define it, and I disagree.
If somebody were like, you're just a sexist and racist, I probably wouldn't be like, define that for me. I'd probably be like, why do you think I'm that?
But what if they have like different ideas of what constitutes a sexist or a racist? Well, like,
I'll try to kill two birds with one stone by saying, what about me makes you think I'm sexist? And when they answer that question, I'll get both their definition likely and then also why they think I'm that. Yeah, asking questions and learning how to do that as a skill set. Yeah.
Would it be good to clarify the goal of this isn't so that like you know how to win every argument?
Yes.
It's more so that if you're convinced for the right reasons.
Yes.
This other person.
Right.
And you don't get like what you find more logic that is more of a. It was really bad. Like you convince somebody to take Christianity seriously by poor reasoning.
Yeah.
And then they discover that reasoning.
Yeah. You convince someone that Christianity is true through a fallacy. And then they find that fallacy out later and it like wrecks them, right? Through poor thinking, right? What you win someone with will be what you lose them with. If you win somebody by like a big band and smoke machine and laser lights, and then that like stops being enough, they don't have anything else to fall back on, right? And so thinking well is what you should be falling back on. And if someone doesn't know how to do that and they've not been shown how to do that, they could get got by a fallacy, and then they could also be lost by a fallacy. And so thinking well is the goal. And it might be the case that you're like, I want to think well, and you have a conversation, and they just like dunk on you, and you're like, dang, I was wrong. And then you leave, right? There's no losing a conversation. We say losing a debate, but conversations aren't debate. They're conversations. You should both be moving toward the truth. And if you get in that conversation, you realize you were incorrect, and you now have been convinced of something that you think is true, that's a win, right? If you have the rug pulled out from under you and you're like, oh man, I lost that conversation and I don't know what to do, you don't lose conversations. You can lose a conversation if you act like a butt. And that person wants nothing else to do with you anymore because you were rude and you were not compassionate and gracious. You didn't meet them where they were, right? You can win a debate and lose a person. And we're not in this business to just win debates. We're in this business to win people, okay? You can absolutely win an argument and lose a person, and that's not the goal. So we're in this to pursue what is true. And as Christians, we believe that if someone is genuinely pursuing the truth, that road leads to Christ. Even if they're 10 miles away from that moment and you're like here in the mud talking about the definition of fascism, whatever, right? If you're in the mud here in this particular situation, you're just one of the bricks in the road. If they're actually pursuing truth, you're one of the bricks in the road to Christ, okay? And so having meaningful conversations is important. It's not about being right all the time, because sometimes you're just wrong. And you need someone to pull the rug out from under you because you're also trying to pursue what is true and you can be incorrect. Yeah, thank you for that, to clarify. Yeah. I feel like I probably should pray. And then if you want to split, you can split. Everyone's like, yes, thank God. Okay, so I'm just kidding. Let's pray. And then if you need to split, you can split. I'll be hanging out for a while. We can talk about this ad infinitum if you want to talk about what's in a room and what's not in a room. Okay. Yeah, let's pray. Father, thank you for a night of simultaneously intense and deep conversation, as well as practical and more surface level application. You are the fashioner, you are the designer, the creator of our mind and the way that we as human beings think and the way that we process. And so we know that if we endeavor to know more about how the mind works, we should follow your example, and we should look for philosophy that glorifies you and not philosophy that glorifies man. So would we bring in what is true, and would we reject what is false, and would you help us to know the difference so that we don't believe something that is untrue and then spread that to others? Would you be glorified in our conversations? Would you be glorified in our going from our meeting this evening? And would you be with us in conversations that we have today and tomorrow? We pray this in your holy name. Amen.